Some of you may or may not know the story about George Stinney. I didn't know who he was until this year. Now, before I get into that, I want to talk about something I believed in for a long time. I believed that the death penalty was a fair punishment for some crimes. I believe that killers like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy deserved the death penalties they received. And it wasn't until March, after hearing the George Stinney case, that I changed my mind. Now, George Stinney was a 14 African-American child who was sentenced to death. It was 1944 when he had a brief encounter with two white children who were later found dead. And now, I don't need to get into specifics because I'm sure that we can all assume what happened next. After an unfair, unjust trial, George Stinney was sentenced to death. Now, because of his height, he needed a Bible to sit on while the electricity ended his life. And it wasn't until 2014 when a judge found him innocent. And yes, in 2020, a 14-year-old most likely will not receive the death penalty, but it doesn't mean that an innocent one won't. There's a current unfairness in the justice system. Not only that, there's also a racial bias when it comes to both victims and the accused. There's also, most likely, men and people of color men will get the death penalty over other genders, so there's a gender and racial bias. That is why I now believe that the death penalty should be abolished within the United States. Now, to begin, all of us can agree in fairness. Now, I understood why Ted Bundy received the death sentence that he got, and it was a fair justice to his victims. And if you didn't know before, that to get the death penalty, you have to be convicted of first-degree premeditated murder or felony murder. So yes, it may seem like it's a fair justice, but a prosecutor does not have to seek out the death penalty. That means that this fair justice varies from prosecutor to prosecutor and basically boils down to one person. Now, the uniqueness of the death penalty case is that there has to be two separate trials. One trial to get convicted, and another trial to see if the death penalty is a fair punishment. Now, although it's hard to think that if someone goes through two trials, it can still be innocent, but it has happened. The DPIC says since 1973, 170 people have been pulled off death row. That means 170 lives were saved. But what about the lives that weren't saved? Now, there's no way to tell exactly how many out of the 1,527 executions who were innocent and who wasn't. But the DPIC says that there are 18 people who have very strong evidence that they were innocent. Now, believe it or not, 1/2 of those people were people of color, and they were all executed from 1997 to 2019, just last year. So although it may seem like how unique these trials are, that it's fair and that they won't be charged if they're innocent, but even if it happens once, it's way too many. So moving forward, so it may seem like the death penalty is a fair punishment for what the accused are said to have done, like I previously said, but I want to show you guys another side of fairness, or lack thereof. The fairness to the victims and what they had to suffer is being exchanged for the fairness of the accused. In the United States, there is a present victim bias. The DPIC says that out of all the executions, 75% of the victims were white. It also states that if there's a white victim, they're more likely to receive the defendant's more likely to receive the death penalty no matter their race. So there's also an unfair justice system for minorities. Now, Craig of the Brennan Center says that African Americans are 3 times more likely to be jailed, despite only being 13% of the population. And yes, there are many underlying factors to why that is, but the fact is, if you're African American, you're more likely to receive the death penalty. Now, Craig also states that out of the 7.3 million people incarcerated formerly and currently, 2.69 million were African American, 2.66 million were white, and 2.3 million were Latino. So like I said previously, African Americans only make up 13% of the population, and Latinos only make up 18% of the population. Now, according to race and the death penalty, white victims make up about half of all murder victims. White victims make about half of all murder victims, but they also make up 80% of all victims in convicted capital cases. That means that there's a white victim, you're more likely to get convicted of a crime. Now, another thing is African Americans are more likely to get the death penalty. According to the same article as I previously said, people of color make about 43% of total executions. They also make up 55% of people who are awaiting execution. So that means whether if an African American did or did not do the crime, they're more likely to receive the death penalty. Now, as I stated, now imagine if the death penalty was not abolished. Now, also imagine if you yourself was not only innocently convicted of a crime, but also innocently punished for the death penalty. This may seem like a far-fetched idea, but a U.S. death row study states that about 4% of all executions, former and current, were innocent. Now, yes, that means that 96% of people got what they deserved. But what about the 4% that were not treated fairly? Like I said many times before, after hearing the heinous things that some people have done to other people, it is so easy to say things like, yes, they deserve to die for what they did. But I want you guys to ask the question that I asked myself after hearing about George Sidney. I asked myself, is the reward of killing an evil man outweigh the risk of killing an innocent one?